So it's Journalism 65 at Laney College. It's the spring 2013 semester. We got Scott Strain over there and Jeff Heyman teaching the class. And we're joined today by Daniel Borenstein, editorial writer for the Contra, Costa Times and the Oakland Tribune.
Correct.
And occasionally the Bay Area News Group overall.
Yes.
And he's going to be talking to the class, answering questions, and telling us the difference between the editorial side of things and the news side, and feature writing and how it all works. But first off, you're a local guy.
Yes, I am.
And you went to UC Berkeley.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about your career and how you got into journalism.
Okay. Well, I started out getting interested in journalism as an undergraduate in college, and I ended up as a journalism and political science undergrad at Berkeley, and then I ended up doing something that most journalists don't do. I actually went to graduate school in public policy and also in journalism, but mainly, but the big difference was the focus on public policy, because it did give me an extra insight. I think that most journalists need to keep in mind that taking journalism classes is very important, but you also have to be able to meld that with a knowledge base in an area of specialty if you can. Whatever it may be, because that's what you bring to the table. That's what makes you unique. When you walk into a newsroom, that's what you can add to the discussion. And for me, having that public policy background has really helped me, first in my years as political editor, and in the last 6 years, I guess it has been as an editorial writer and columnist, because my specialty basically is public policy and public finance.
Good. Well, it's always good for students to hear how people get started and their steps through the profession. So what was your first job in journalism and reporting, and kind of walk us through?
Well, I started out as a student, I spent a lot of time focusing on broadcast journalism until the very end, when I got an internship at what was then called the Berkeley Gazette in print. And I realized that, for me at least, I found print a lot more satisfying, because frankly I spent less time lugging around equipment and more time actually focusing on the journalism itself, on the reporting, on the getting to the story itself. I have a lot of respect for TV and radio journalists, but I think that a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of reporting is really done by the print journalists, often done by the print journalists, who can spend more time actually doing the research rather than having to lug the equipment around and get the sound bites. And so I found it much more satisfying. And I started my career after that in print after college as a City Hall reporter in Antioch. And I've worked in the East Bay my entire career. Became a county reporter eventually. Along the way I did the standard covering cops, writing obituaries, all the usual stuff. And then in the early 90s, I became political editor for the paper, and Sacramento editor for a couple of years, and ended up eventually, and I worked as an editor, editing other reporters' copy for several years, and ended up finally in, I think it was 2007, moving to the editorial page.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We'll speak up a little more.
Yeah. Okay.
No, we'll speak
so
up
I
a
should
little more.
talk to you. That would be nice. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can also
Okay.
move over here. So
Yeah.
yeah. This is sort of a new format for us, which Joe is going to fix and post.
Lots of luck with that, Joe.
Right. So,
you can only do so much to fix this.
Right. Now, this is just for students anyway. Okay, so you've done pretty much everything one could do within journalism in that era. That's pretty exciting. But what sort of stands out as something that was really that formed you as a reporter? What kind of stories? Was it that City Hall stuff? Was it really, getting out on following a story, investigative reporting, obituary writing? Well, what was it?
Well, the government and the politics and the policy overlap pretty strongly. When I started out covering government, I came to realize that it's really multifaceted. It's about the numbers, it's about the service, it's about the politics, who gets special treatment. It's about the people who try and game the system. Early on in my, within the first 3 or 4 months as the beat reporter out in Antioch, I remember very distinctly going out to this apartment building because I think somebody had called me and said, you really need to go out and look at this apartment building. It's sitting there unfinished. It's been sitting there for months unfinished. And there are walkways up on the 2nd story with no railing. Some kid's going to get hurt. And so I went out there, and lo and behold, it was true. And I started calling around, finding out what the deal was with this apartment building. And it turned out, as I recall, it was owned by a guy who had bought the place and was investing in property. And I tried to reach him, and I started to find out there was a lawsuit circling around this building. And I found out there were more lawsuits circling around this guy. Well, as I dug deeper, I found out that this was a guy who was running basically a real estate Ponzi scheme, where he was borrowing money from people, and he was taking property, and he was borrowing money using the property as security, but he was using that property as security for loans to multiple different people and borrowing money far in excess of the value of the buildings. And he was doing this scheme all over the area. And a lot of people had invested had loaned him money because he'd promised them great returns, and after all, it was secured by property. They didn't take the time or find out that he'd promised that same property as security to other people. And lo and behold, basically a lot of them lost a lot of money. A lot of these people were retirees who invested their retirement in it. The guy was eventually criminally charged. He fled. I went to cover the trial, and lo and behold, one day I showed up for court. He was out on bail during the trial. And one day I came in, and the judge called me into his chambers, and he said, well, just, because he knew I'd been following the case, and I'd been in court every day. And he said, just so you know, there's a warrant out for his arrest because he fled last night. He hasn't shown up. His attorney says he doesn't know where he is. And we're going to go ahead with the trial anyhow. They tried in absentia, and he was convicted. And 10 years later, they tracked him down. He had a new name. He was living, I think, in Kentucky or Tennessee. And he's running the same scam all over again. So, but what was it? It was a city story in terms of, it started as this little city story about the missing balcony railing. It was about building inspectors who hadn't looked at it. It was about the building permits. This guy was getting building permits all over the place for these questionable projects because he was contributing money to the local politicians. He was running, it was a finance story because he was running a scam. It had all the elements. And what it taught me about tracking court documents. It taught me a lot about understanding how real estate transactions worked. This was all in basically my first year on the job. It was a big learning experience.
And follow the money.
And follow the money, absolutely.
That's an
and
important
follow
one.
the money, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about, because it's not often we get to talk to somebody that's on an editorial board and has gone all the way from news writing all the way up through the ranks and everything. But tell us how the editorial process works and kind of walk us through the structure of a news organization.
Okay, here's the important thing that you all need to really understand about a newsroom. We talk about what we call the wall, if you will. There are two sides of a newsroom. There are the news reporters, the sports department, the features department, the local news department, the regional county team, if you will, and it may be the state house reporters and the national reporters, depending on how big a newsroom it is. Those are all over in the news side. These are the people who are supposed to objectively report the news, analyze it, and present it to you. And it's, the idea is this will be a fair and balanced, and we can talk about what that means later if you want, news report. And then on the other side of the wall are the opinion writers. Those are the people who write the editorials. Those are the people, the columnists who write opinion columns. Those opinion columns, hopefully, if you want to have a good reputation, are based on fact, based on research. But you get to inject the next step. You get to opine as to whether you think something is right or wrong. You get to say what you think should be fixed, if you will. You get to issue your opinion. I, for most of my career, worked on the news side of the wall, reporting, and the goal was you really want to make sure to keep your personal opinion out of it. You wanted to be a reliable purveyor of facts, if you will. Okay, analysis is not opinion. You may do an analysis of it, but you were expected to provide something that was not opinion, which it was not. You weren't supposed to take that next step and inject your own thoughts as to what should or shouldn't happen into the story. About 6 or 7 years ago, the opinion page editor came to me, said, "Would you like to come work for me?" We'd worked together before, and I said, "Yeah, this sounds like an interesting new opportunity." And our executive editor, when I was making the move, said to me, frankly, "Dan, the hardest thing about being an opinion writer is having an opinion." And that's true to a certain extent. It's, which is not to say that the news side job is not hard. It's very hard. But what it is to say is that to take it the next step, you have to not only ferret out what happened, but you have to then ask yourself, what should happen here? What's the right outcome, and how should you get there? And that is not always easy because the solutions are not always obvious. So you have this news side that we talked about, and I think that's what most people look at. But as you know, probably if you read a regular newspaper, you get to the back of the front section and there's the opinion page. That's where I work, so to speak. And I write editorials, which are the voice of the paper, if you will. They're unsigned pieces that represent the collective feeling of the opinion page staff and the publisher as to what we collectively as a newspaper think should happen. And I also write a column, which appears on Sundays. And that is my opinion. That is what I think should happen. Usually the two dovetail because actually our collective opinion tends to pretty much be in sync with my own personal opinion. And sometimes we may disagree collectively as to what should happen, but for the most part, we're pretty much in sync. But all of that you should be, I get these emails from people saying, "You're biased." Well, yeah, I am. If bias means you have an opinion, yes, I am. If bias means I skew the facts, no, I'm not, because I take great pride in ferreting out the facts and doing a lot of careful research for my opinion columns and editorials. They upset people because they don't like what I often write because they either don't like the underlying facts, or they don't like what my conclusions are, my opinion of what those facts indicate. But yeah, they're biased. That's the point of an opinion writer. I have an opinion, and if you define bias as having an opinion, yeah, that's what it's all about.
So I think that was a great, clear, rendering of the difference.
Yeah.
And I guess so. If someone called up the news department and said you're biased, then you'd have a problem. But if someone calls up or writes a column and says you're biased, you're saying, well, I'm doing my job.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm expected as as that executive editor told me back 6, 7 years ago, the hardest thing about working on an editorial page is developing that opinion, is figuring it out, figuring out the solution, not only the problem, figuring out where you stand and putting yourself out there with it.
Yeah. So we have the column that's going to come. We're doing this on a Friday, and this is the column that's going to come up on Sunday, which happens to be online already.
Right.
Now, this is your opinion column.
This is my opinion column.
And so tell us, if this had been a news story, how would that headline be different? You couldn't really say drop the ball. That's an opinion.
Well, actually, you probably could.
You could?
You know, I mean, the interesting thing about some of my columns, and this one, is I do so much reporting for them that I often sometimes break news, if you will, in my columns. And this happens to be one of them. But I can not only present the facts of what happened, but lace it with my opinion.
What should
should
then
happen,
take place.
and I can draw the conclusion of who erred, who did wrong, as opposed to perhaps saying here are the facts and letting somebody else draw that conclusion. And in this piece, I very clearly drew the opinion of what went wrong. Yeah.
And who dropped the ball.
And who dropped the ball.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, and this piece I wrote yesterday afternoon and literally this morning. This piece was finished a little over 2 hours ago. And it's, you know, it's interesting. I had not seen it up online until we got here. I actually don't think that's probably the best photograph to go with the headline, because that's not one of the attorneys who was criticized by the headline. That's actually one of the other people who dropped the ball, but it's not the person I specifically, not the people I specifically. That's the negotiator, who also dropped the ball in a big way. Yeah. Okay, but not the one I really target in this piece. I criticize them, but those aren't the people I criticize in this particular piece.
Well, just using that as an aside, I mean, that does point to photo editing, headline writing, which you wouldn't do. Do you suggest a headline for your column?
I actually often write the headline.
Okay, you do. Because that's unusual for news, of course.
That's not as unusual anymore as you think. As we have consolidated, that happens more and more.
Okay.
But for online, that's very common now. I wrote that headline, and I had a discussion with one of the producers yesterday about the photo. I guess they don't have a photo of the attorneys I was singling out. I'm not sure how they chose that. Mm-hmm. That happened after I turned it in. But it's okay photo.
Yeah.
It just would not have been my first pick.
Okay. Now, you know, I have a bunch of questions about social media because that's one of the topics in this class, of course. But I want to just focus a little bit longer on the editorial process and editorial boards. Then I'm going to circle back around and talk about social media and how it's changed, just so you guys have a heads up. Now, talk about how an editorial board works. I mean, you're on the editorial board.
I am on the editorial board.
Who generally makes up the board? How does that work, and how does that sort of formulate opinion?
It really depends. And what's happened in opinion pages, as we've consolidated, as you might imagine, our editorial boards have gotten smaller too. Yeah. Basically, for the East Bay right now, for the editorial boards here, we are basically down to there are about 4 people, the publisher, and 3 people who work on the opinion page, who for the East Bay issues pretty much comprise the editorial board. When we look at more bigger regional issues, we may combine our efforts and our thinking with the equivalent editorial writers and staff down at San Jose Mercury News, our sister paper down there, and collectively reach an agreement. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we go out on our own. Yeah. So it's a small group now. It used to be much bigger. We used to have much bigger staffs. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, we don't sit and collectively discuss every editorial before we write it, because we sort of know where we are at as an institution, where we've been in the past, generally sort of the thinking of the publisher and of ourselves. We know each other well enough that we generally know. And so basically, I will turn in a piece to my boss, who is the editorial page editor, who's also a member, of course, of the editorial board. And if he disagrees a little bit, we might discuss it, or he might tweak it a little bit. But pretty much we're in sync. Pretty much we think alike on most issues. That comes from lots of years of developing things. We tend to think we tend to discuss issues sometimes in advance, where we will say, you know, what did you think about this, you know, and this concerned me, and we might sort of disagree going in on something and say, well, you might think about this, and we sort of come to the meeting of the minds, if you will. So that's kind of how the editorials are developed. And then I think everybody has their own writing style as to how they go about writing the editorials. I tend to write more of the local editorials. My boss tends to write more of the national editorials. We kind of split the state editorials between us.
Okay. And then, of course, one of the most important functions of an editorial board is around election time and candidates and making endorsements for candidates, right? And, of course...
Very difficult process, yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then we have a little bit of a video to show, too.
Sure. On the local races, we in the past have tried to editorialize and make our recommendations in local elections in as many races as we can. As we get smaller and smaller in staff, and concurrently, as more and more local governments push all of their elections to even-numbered years. Almost no governments now hold their elections in odd-numbered years. They try and line them up with the statewide election years because it saves them costs. What happens is the even-numbered years become huge in terms of the number of elections, and that becomes really difficult for us. So frankly, what we do is we divide them up. Most of the local elections, the interviews for them fall to me or to me and my boss. And
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. Last September, I think we figured we did 75 or 80 races and ballot measures. And we do them in different ways. In the old days, we used to bring in each candidate one at a time, sit down and interview them with a much larger staff back then. These days, what we do, and I'm not sure it's actually better, I think it may be just as good and maybe better in certain senses, we usually bring in candidates for, say, a city council all together. And we also more and more videotape them in terms of social media, you know, in terms of using online media now. We tend to do that more. But what the advantage of that, which I actually kind of like, is that we have them there at the same time, and we can, sitting in the room right then, see the differences and isolate the differences, and it's fresh in our mind, the differences. Whereas if we'd had one at 1 o'clock on one day and somebody at 4 on the next, you then would have to remember, it's harder to remember, and it allows them to react to each other.
It's almost like a mini debate.
It's like a mini debate, or a mini forum, if you will. And in certain ways, it's been very effective. It's time efficient, and I think it really helps us isolate the issues. We spend a lot of time trying to prepare for that. Researching, we obviously are researching on an ongoing basis because our news side covers these issues. We're in touch on a parallel path all the time with local officials from the editorial page. We on the editorial page talking with them about what's going on, talking about what's, keeping ourselves up to date. But come election time, we usually use that as a step back time to sit and say, okay, let's look at where their budgets have gone in the last 2 years. Let's look at what they said they would change 4 years ago when these incumbents were running for office. Let's take the broader view, use this as a moment to look at that. And we try and do that. And that requires research going in. And it requires a lot of work. Those are long days.
Those are.
Those are very long days.
Why don't you set up this video while I'm finding it here.
Okay.
and tell us what we're
Yeah,
gonna
well,
see.
this was an interesting, and the reason I suggested this to Jeff is one of the questions that we sometimes get, and I get it more from candidates, though, is, but I get it from journalism students, is what is the interview process like in the when we're trying to decide who to endorse?
Right.
And what we're about to see, this was a very critical race for a state assembly race seat. It was in a district that, frankly, was pretty evenly divided in terms of political party, so we knew it was likely to be a close race. In the previous election, the same two candidates had run against each other. And what you're about to see is, and give me a second to set this up, if you will. The gentleman sitting here at the top, his name is Abram Wilson, and he was the mayor of San Ramon. And he had run in 2008, if I remember. This is from 2010, if I remember correctly. And in 2008, he had run, and we had endorsed him, actually. He was the Republican in the race. The woman below, who is the current incumbent, Joan Buchanan, was the Democrat. And Joan had won. And actually, she had done a pretty good job in the first couple years, we thought. But we were more concerned about what Abram Wilson was doing back in San Ramon at that same time, because he continued to be mayor, and we had done some reporting on the salary of the mayor of San Ramon, who ranked among the very, very top in the state. And this was a time also that the Bell stuff was starting to come out. And we were asking, well, what's going on here? San Ramon is a city of 60, 70,000 people. Why do they have the most highly paid, and maybe 80, why do they have the most highly paid, or one of the very highest paid city managers in the state? How could this be?
City manager or mayor?
City manager. He's the mayor, okay. But he was the one who signed the contract, the employment contract on a regular basis for the city manager. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, it turned out, the city manager then was the one who was recommending to the mayor and the city council changes in the pension program for the city employees, including the city manager. And more importantly, when the city manager would recommend and the council would approve pension increases or salary increases for the mayor, for the city manager, that would affect his pension. So two things were going on simultaneously. They were increasing the value of the pensions for the city employees, and they were increasing the salary of the city manager so that he was not only benefiting from an increased benefit rate, but it was based on his salary, which was also going up.
So is it like PERS and it's about
It was PERS. It was PERS.
But by the way, you were talking to one of the experts on public pensions in the state,
Yeah,
if
that's
not the
probably
country.
true.
I mean,
Yeah, in
seriously.
terms of
And
journalists.
I was going to come back to that.
System.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's.
But so what we wanted to know so what we did is, this was an unusual situation because, frankly, we had endorsed Abram Wilson in 2008. We were bringing him back, and we were very troubled by what had gone on in San Ramon. And at the same time, we were relatively pleased with how Joan Buchanan had done in office. So we had a difficult decision. Were we going to change our endorsement from the same two candidates from 2 years earlier?
Her position was what?
She was a Democrat running. Yeah.
Against.
For assembly. She was running. She had been on the school board in 2008. She ran for assembly. She won. We had endorsed Abram Wilson, who had run against her in 2008. Now it was 2 years later. They were running against each other again for the same assembly seat. Abram Wilson was still mayor. Joan Buchanan had been in the assembly for 2 years. We had to decide now, 2 years later, were we going to change our endorsement from 2 years of, same two candidates, what were we going to do? And so we had interviewed them. We were very torn. This was a big endorsement because it was a race that really mattered in terms of it was actually competitive. What we had to say could really tip the balance in this race. And so this was one where we brought them back in, and in an unusual situation, the publisher wanted to sit in on it, and we had the political editor in to ask questions too, and we had other people. So this was a relatively big group. This is taped in the publisher's office, which you're about to see. And what I was asking him, and what you'll see in this, is we had explained, I'd already written columns explaining how his signing of these employment contracts for the city manager were boosting his pension. And Abram Wilson was shockingly ignorant of how the pension system worked for his own city. And he kept saying to me, falsely, he had said, when he was asked about this at a previous forum, he had said, well, the city manager actually doesn't have a standard pension, he has his own. Apparently, he was unaware that the very contract he signed that talked about the PERS benefits for the city manager, that the city manager was in PERS just like the other employees. And he was oblivious to the fact that by approving the salary increase, he was also boosting the pension. So this is where we brought him in. What? Pension percentage and amount. Okay, because you move the salary up, you move the percentage of salary that counts towards the pension up, so when it comes time for him to retire, it all goes up. It's a double whammy, okay? So,
all right, so
we were really disturbed by what he had said about this guy has his own pension, which was just flatly false. I had been writing the columns about what had happened with the city manager's contract, and we were frankly floored that Abram Wilson apparently wasn't reading his own hometown paper. Knew what he was signing.
Okay,
so this is what transpired. And I don't know if we got.
Sitting in the same chair?
No, yeah, they're sitting in the same chair at different times. Okay, so we'll just look at Abram Wilson.
We obviously know both the candidates fairly well. We frankly are pretty torn on what we're going to do. And so we decided we need to have another set of sit-downs. And we need to have another set of sit-downs that David could sit in on so that he could get a feel for it and so that we could all get a feel for it. Let me start out with a couple questions.
Okay.
Starting with what has been perhaps the most
This is me talking.
contentious issue raised about you during this campaign.
The only issue raised about me.
Well, the only issue raised.
The only issue
Okay.
raised. Yes.
But I want to ask in a slightly. I mean, we've heard your defense of the salary.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But during the Contra Costa Council Forum,
Yeah. Okay.
okay, Lisa asked you about the pension implications of
Right.
that salary.
Right.
And you said two things. You first said spiking is so egregiously being taken advantage of. That's the first thing we need to do is to stop the spiking.
Yes.
And then you were asked the effect of Mr. Muniz's salary on his pension.
The spiking.
No, there's the effect of his salary on his pension.
Okay.
Okay, the controversial salary that he receives
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and the effect on his pension. And your response was, Mr. Muniz has a private, and then you stopped, and then you start a new sentence that says, we pay him his benefits and they go into his own retirement. You'll have to discuss that with him.
Can we stop this for
Could
1
you
second?
elaborate on that?
All right.
He had said in this debate that Moniz, the city manager, had a private pension. In essence, that he wasn't in CalPERS, that he arranged his own pension out of his salary. That was flatly wrong. That was just wrong. Whether he was lying or he was ignorant, I don't know. I don't know to this day. But he was running. The other little piece that I didn't add is he was running as a conservative Republican calling for pension reform at the state level. He was running for assembly, calling for pension reform at the state level, while within his own city, he was the one signing the contracts, increasing the city manager's salary, and thereby radically increasing his pension, increasing his salary to one of the highest in the state, and thereby drastically increasing his pension to one of the highest for a city manager anywhere in the state.
Spiking, the beginning question was spiking. We don't have spiking in our city at all. That's something that we looked at as a council and said that that was egregious, and I believe that you should have, should be a combination of one's entire career versus that last year. And as far as Herb's benefits and things like that, since we give him those funds he invested, I felt that he would be the best person to address that.
See, that was flatly wrong. He wasn't investing it. The city was paying into CalPERS for him, just like any other city employee. So he kept repeating this fiction that Herb Moniz was not getting a CalPERS pension like the other city employees. It was just flatly wrong.
Now, can I ask you some specifics about this, or is there more of the video that?
There's more video to go. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll let it go, because I have some. Okay.
Yeah, let's watch how this
Since you
unpeeled.
give him those funds, he invests it.
Yes.
How is that?
I've never gone into detail about that, as far as how he invests that's.
No, not that. I think it's how isn't it, doesn't he, so he doesn't belong to CalPERS?
He does belong to CalPERS, but he takes those funds and he decides what percentage goes into what, his health care and everything like that.
This
No,
is
I'm talking about
fantasy what
pension.
he's saying.
The pension itself,
The pension itself.
and in relation to spiking or,
Okay. The question
Sorry.
originally was,
all right,
Mr. Moniz has a salary, which
yes,
we all understand is rather large. Whether it's merited or not, we can sit here and debate. But that's not let's just accept. It was large and it has grown larger in the last 10 years.
his salary, when you look at his salary, is, I think, in line with a lot of other.
We
Yes,
understand that.
Okay.
We
Yeah,
understand that
all right.
we've heard your defense of the salary. We don't need to cover that ground. You've been asked that question a gazillion times.
All right.
Okay? I'm not asking you to go over that ground again. What I'm trying to understand here is the effect of that salary on his pension, and hence on the city's pension costs.
Well, I look at not Mr. Moniz's pension costs. I look at the entire staff, and that has been 100% funded. I don't just turn around and say, this is Herb's, this is everyone else's. So I look at I get a number, we receive a number from CalPERS, and I say, okay, make sure that is 100% funded. That's the number I need to look at. That's the number we need to address.
Okay, so what do you mean when you say he invests that?
We give him the funds. He decides what he wants to do with it. I have never discussed with her how he portions those funds or what he does with it. That's his business,
Is
not
that how
mine.
CalPERS does it with everybody?
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, it's not.
How does it work for him?
We give him the funds, and he decides on what he wants to put in his pension, what he wants to invest, how he wants to take care of his medical. All of that is his. When I look at this, go ahead.
So
This is the publisher talking.
So he gets the salary, and he gets this
The benefit.
bucket that would have been a benefit bucket,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Including pension.
Yes,
And he can use that pension, he can either put it into the pension,
he can
or
do
he
it.
could keep it as income, or he could put it against salary, or benefits. Is that the flexibility that
He
you're
has,
talking about?
yes, the flexibility of doing whatever he wants to do with that.
Does CalPERS allow you to be
Hold
an
on.
individual member?
Hold on,
I'm
hold on,
confused.
hold on a second. Yeah, hold on a second. With all due respect,
Yes,
that's not what his contract says.
okay.
Okay? That's not what his contract, which you have signed, says. His contract specifically says that he gets the same benefit level, which the city pays for, separate from his salary, that goes into,
The same benefit package.
he gets the same pension package.
Yes,
He gets the I believe it's
2.7. It's 2.7.
Okay. And that 2.7 is calculated on his salary.
Yes,
Okay. That's not a discretion out of a separate pot of money that he has discretion. The city pays for that.
but there is the portion that he gets as his salary that we pay for, and then there's that other benefit package that's there that he determines what goes into that.
Yes, there is a separate benefit package, but that's not his pension. That's his health insurance.
His health insurance and anything else that he wants in that
That's
package.
right.
Yes,
But that's not.
and that's
But my
okay.
question had to do with his pension.
When I look at that, I look at what we pay him, and maybe I misunderstood you. I look at the bottom line on everything I do. And the bottom line is the covering the pension obligation that the city has. And that's what I look at. And that's when the number comes before me, I make sure that it is 100% funded.
Okay, well, first of all, your pension fund is not 100%.
Really
And
separate.
I would like the city.
Okay, so
he gets caught.
okay, here's the moral. Here's the moral of this whole story. Okay, if Abram Wilson had at least said, we pay him a lot of salary, and we know that also drives up our pension costs, because it does, because they're tied together. And oh, by the way, we increased everybody's pension benefits at the city manager's recommendation, and the city manager is going to personally benefit from that hugely because of it. If he had at least copped to that and said, but we think it's worth it, we might have had grounds for a disagreement, but a discussion. But he was running as a pension reformer. And he was so ignorant of what he had done himself in his own city and how the pensions worked, and was so evasive in his answers that he lost us in terms of his ever getting our endorsement again. We not only lost us in terms of getting our endorsement again for assembly, but when he ran for for mayor again 2 years later, whereas we had endorsed him in the past, we could not ever do it again, and he lost. And the moral of the story for candidates is, A, be honest, B, come into the setting informed of what you're talking about, and if you don't know what you're talking about, cop to it. Don't try and bluff your way through it, because if we catch you, we aren't very forgiving on it, because we figure if you're lying to us, you're lying to the public, and that's not the kind of integrity we want in elective office.
So wait, hold on. We'll take questions right at the very end.
But here's the interesting thing about this, okay? Here he was running as a Republican, as a conservative, tax-sensitive, cost-saving, pension-reforming conservative. There were several people who saw this on our website and this video spread pretty quickly through the political
Actually,
community.
you just stole my thunder.
Yeah.
That was going to be one of my questions.
Right, and there were a lot of Republicans who, when they saw this, said, "We can't vote for him."
Well, see, I was going to bring that, but let me ask you one thing first. I think for students who want to be reporters one day, for journalism students, there's also another important takeaway is that you got to do your research to be able to pose those questions, and some of those people are very good at being evasive, sounding like they know what they're talking about. But you got to have your data and your research down.
And just so you understand, we went into this, and I was very specific and articulate about the details of the pensions. Of the pension. And so you understand, I've been writing about pensions for a few years before that to begin with. Secondly, I'd actually done a couple of columns on this particular city manager's contract and pensions. So I had spent hours and hours down at City Hall pouring through his contracts.
And you'd hope that he would have read some of that stuff. It doesn't sound
I
like
had
it.
read them all, and I had read what the mayor had actually signed. And I got to say, I don't think the mayor had read what the mayor had actually signed. And that was where it became a real concern.
All right, now let's talk about some logistics and social media and stuff. And that was one of the things I was going to ask you. So how much? So just generally, I'm going to ask you in a minute how things have changed. But by using a technique like this, where instead of the doors were closed, you did an interview, you guys wrote about it, you now have the ability very easily to do video, get it up on the web, get it out on social media, and it's tell us how you alluded to it, how this really spread really quickly. But that's a whole new realm for something like this.
That's a relatively new realm. It's not, let's differentiate. The notion of doing video and posting it on the internet, we've been doing that for a decade or more, right? I mean, that's not new. We've gotten better at it, arguably. We do a lot more of it than we used to because the web has become more and more important, and we put more and more resources towards that. And so to that extent, we're just doing more of it, and we're doing it better. And we're making more use of it like this, especially in things like campaigns. There are times when we'll hold editorial boards like this with candidates, and we want to videotape them so everybody else can hear too. There are times, candidly though, where we'll do editorial boards or I will do interviews, and they will be completely off the record. And we will not videotape them, and we wouldn't put them up, because we want people who really know, who can tell us stuff, who aren't running for office, but who have a lot of knowledge, who are willing to educate us but don't want to be out there doing so. And so we wouldn't do this with everybody.
But these are public officials.
But these are public officials. We feel that they need to be accountable. And so we'll do something like this with them. But what becomes interesting, and now we go to social media, if you will.
Yeah.
And I differentiate the web from social media,
right,
if you will.
which we do.
Okay. Is where this was done three years ago. Okay. And Twitter was just coming into its own, and Facebook was relatively young for us. If we were to do this today, frankly, we would be sending out tweets and posting this on Facebook, and I think this would spread even faster than it did. Because this is the sort of thing that when people see it, this has what I call the holy cow factor. It's not quite the words I use. But you know,
You used to say it has legs. But
it has legs. This has legs. This, you know, we talk in the news business about are these stories that are either A, important, or B, people will talk about. This has both elements of it. This is something that's very important and is something that has a high outrage factor that people are going to talk about. And they were talking about this quick. And I can only imagine if this was, you know, today as opposed to 3 years ago, this would have been even faster.
Well, yeah, you know, before we open it up for questions, talk about that. Talk about the changes you've seen through your career in the newspaper industry generally, and how social media has changed things, and just that kind of thing. What have
Okay,
you seen?
let's talk about how the social media has changed things, and frankly, how the web has changed things too. Because for my career, the web has really only been a force in it for a little over half of it, if you will. I've been doing journalism for over 30 years, and the web really came into its being in the 1993, 1994 probably is when we first really started to see newspapers starting to realize it. So that's, 20 years ago, a little more than half, I guess, of my career. And what it has done most significantly is it's taken a regional newspaper, the Contra Costa Times, the Oakland Tribune, and it has turned us into to an institution that can have, on important stories, statewide or even national exposure. It broadens our reach. When I first started as political editor in 1991, if I wrote a story, it would appear in the newspaper in my readership area, and that's as far, in most cases, that it would ever travel. By 5 years later, we had the web, we had our website. The links to my stories, if they were of important statewide significance, were running on blogs and summation sites, if you will, in Sacramento, and people were linking out of Sacramento. And so it expanded further. And those grew more and more. And then, now that we have social media, I've got friends and I've got people following me because they know that I write on important things now from all over the country. So I will write on something and I'll get emails back sometimes from the Midwest or the East Coast about what I write. The reach of where we go is much broader because of the web, and then again, even more so because of social media.
And you guys mostly use social media to drive traffic back to the website.
That's the main objective, because advertising. It's still,
Well, it always was.
That's exactly right. It's still about, we still got to find a way to pay for the enterprise, if you will.
And driving traffic to the main website where the ads are, doesn't.
Right.
So like your
exactly.
Twitter feed, it's like a tease for stories on.
Basically, my Twitter feed will contain a short bit.ly link to the website.
And we all know how to use Bitly in class, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I will, if the column we saw earlier, I will tweet out either later this afternoon or tomorrow or Sunday morning, and I'll probably do it a couple more times, just to make sure that the people who are following me know about it. Because the people who are following me, usually what I write about, they're following me because what I write is what they're interested in. And, it'll get retweeted. And most of my readership probably is still the newspapers, the print, but the proportion is shifting. And clearly that trend is going to continue. And when the two lines cross, we don't know. It's probably not going to be too far in the future.
Okay, good. All right, I kind of promised to get you out of here by 3, but we're
That's
going
okay.
a little. Was that all right?
That's
all right.
absolutely fine.
Let's open it up to some questions. So I'm going to pass. If you guys have a question, let me know. Anybody? Okay. Of course, it's got to be the furthest person.
Fortunately, the cord reaches.
This isn't really about the industry, but who or what do you like to read on the web or in print to keep your mind and your style fresh?
That's really that's really good. It's interesting because here's what my daily reading looks like. How's that? Of course, I start out by reading our papers. I then go to our competition. The first most primary one is the Chronicle. Then I go, because my next big thing I want to stay in touch with is statewide issues. So I go to a site called Rough and Tumble, www.rtumble.com. You might put that up and you guys can see it. But what it is a link to all the state-related, the government-related key stories across the state. No, it's rtumble.com. And it's you don't even have to Google. Just put it up in the yeah, there you go. Okay. And what this is, this is the top stories of the day from all the papers across the state. And so this is how I know what's going on across the state. That's to keep me apprised, keep me up to date, if you will. That's how I start my morning. Okay. And then more and more, as I've moved to the opinion side, I like to read some of the statewide columnists I really respect. At the state level, two of the people I really like to read are George Skelton and Dan Walters. Skelton of LA Times, Walters of the Sacramento Bee. And then I tend to like to poke around, frankly, most importantly, on national issues. I like the New York Times website because I think they're really smart writers. The editorial page I like because first of all, I like and I'm envious that the editorial page has a homepage presence all the time that has a fixed position on their homepage. And I've been trying to get us the same thing there because I really think that editorial pages drive traffic and they're really interesting. I think that a lot of the people, we talk about, we like to get people involved with the article commenting and all. And my thing is, well, if that's what you want, what better venue than the opinion pages? And the New York Times shows that over and over again. So the opinion, their editorials are very well thought out and interesting. But more importantly, their columnists, who are across a good spectrum, are really good writers and smart writers. I enjoy reading them. Then I get all sorts of things because I'm writing on pensions so much. I have somehow, for example, ended up on a magazine that gets mailed to me called Contingencies, which is the pension actuaries magazine. There's a trade magazine for everything. Every once in a while, I'll actually read it. I'm that much of a nerd these days. Not too often. But the other thing I really enjoy is I subscribe to the New Yorker. And I actually, I subscribe to,
The paper edition.
I subscribe to the paper edition. Here's the reason I subscribe to the paper edition. I don't read anything in paper anymore. I read it all on my iPad. Okay, but the reason I subscribe to it is it turns out that if you want just the electronic subscription to the New Yorker, when I did the research about a year ago, it was more expensive to get that than to subscribe to the print and get the electronic as part of it. So I get the New Yorker. Frankly, I toss the New Yorker print as soon as it arrives in the mail, and I download it on my iPad.